Hey, welcome back to the Well Dwellers podcast. I'm Erik Freiburger, and I'm so glad you're here to hear the conversation that is about to take place between me and my good friend Ty Regan as we kind of digest and reflect back on an amazing time we had not too long ago at the FCJ Centre, where he hosted a retreat centering on grief and disability and belonging. There was a small community of us together. Shima from the Knox United was there, as well as Ty and myself, and we had some pretty in-depth conversations. I think over the day, it was a wonderful time in a beautiful facility. So let's get started with something that I found really particularly reflective and spiritually speaking in the retreat, as we started with a land acknowledgement that Ty had wisely crafted with some beautiful language. We acknowledge we have failed to see the person on these treaty lands, usurping sacred teachings of First Peoples around disabilities to fit the confines of colonial medical models and normalcy. As we continue the journey of reconciliation of Treaty 7, that includes the settlers in healthy collaboration with First Nations of the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, the Northwest Métis Homeland, Nose Hill, and Elbow districts, to renew and reclaim disabilities as a gift. So that's a great way for us to reflect on the roots of our land and who we are as a people who belong to Treaty 7 and Alberta's history and story. Ty, Regan, this is great. You're back on the well with me, and I'm excited to have you with me today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here and continue this conversation. As we know, as the land acknowledgement, one of the roots of that is it's a call to action, reconciliation. Being discomfortably comfortable with knowing the truth of what has happened, and where do we go from here? We need to acknowledge what an actual treaty is. It's a sacred covenant between two parties in perpetuity forever, and how you get back on track. Some of the learnings I've done, and I always take correction if I veer off on these things, but it's also about sharing a bit of who we are and where we've come from. And in my own life, I do take it kind of as a part of an opening prayer. It's not just perfunctory institutional words to check a box we've done a reconciliation action. These are very personal things as to why should we be trusted in this interaction, this conversation we're having with one another. So I'm hoping we've laid some groundwork here on what we want at the well today, and understanding that intrinsic value piece that sometimes we so easily forget because we create these perpetual communities of lack. Where to get that support, you're in that idea of grieving all the time.
Yeah. I think one of the things I was thinking about was, you're right, the way you articulate and write these land acknowledgements, because I've seen you share these before in different ways and in different forms. It almost becomes a bridge of a relational description between us and the land we're in, and the history of the roots of the people of this land. But you have this way of making it come alive. I don't know how to describe it. It becomes a living acknowledgement, as opposed to just the formalities of before events happen. So can you maybe tell me what inspired you in this, and what helped you shape how to do this?
I think back to years ago when I was a Franciscan novitiate within the Anglican Church here in Calgary, and we would teach confirmation. And we talked about what liturgy is, liturgical prayers. And what was the image that was created is it's the coat hanger. But how do we adorn it? How do we make it us? And so when I'd interact with some elders and some ministers from the Indigenous ministries and different churches, and they talk about this personalization piece that I knew was missing, it was that was that connection overlap I finally saw. It's like, okay, so where we exist now, what is the blessings that's come from that? Being on this land, what have we cultivated from that? How is it part of the story? And then thinking about where are we now? I don't know if you've ever written a collect in a liturgical prayer service, but that's kind of the idea of bringing together all the different ideas of that day and personalizing it for that community. So that's some of the things that run through my mind when I sit down going, okay, what's going on here? Sometimes it might be off the cuff. It'll be very brutal and disproportionate. Other times I've got some time to think it through. And with some students, I will use the institutional one, then have them craft their own. What's your story here? Especially when you think of if we travel outside Treaty 7 lands. We are from Treaty 7. That's where we come from, and we're entering new lands with new nations. And how does that shape our understanding and bridge that collaborative reconciliation work? And what are those key things? And I remember I was reading something and I found that sacred teaching of disability as gifts. And I thought, that is a major divergence. How would our systems change, whether it be church with our cure theology and myths of normalcy, government supports where we have to prove constant lack and deficiency to qualify? What
Hmm.
shifts if we change it to this idea of this is who the person is, and now how do we help that person thrive? Because they're an intrinsic part of our community, a gift for it.
Mm. You have my imagination going to a time I experienced the blanket ceremony with Reverend
Mm,
Tony Snow,
yes.
and of course he shared it with the vision of the nations being on each of the
Mm-hmm.
blankets. I wonder what would happen if we started experiencing the blanket ceremony in a different way, where instead of nations, we had people groups. We had
Mm,
a blanket for disability. We had a blanket
mm,
for LGBTQ. We had a blanket for indigenous. We have blankets for, and just kind
mm,
of shape it around that experience. That would,
mm.
I wonder what that would be like.
It'd be
But
intriguing, but it'd reflect the village, right? Which is what the
yeah,
word Canada's root is.
that's cool. And the other thing is, I was thinking we should really hold classes for this around writing land acknowledgements
Mm-hmm.
from that relational standpoint. I think it would be a great way, or even for our youth to
Mm-hmm.
experience that in a growing up pattern of writing that land
Mm-hmm.
acknowledgement. But hmm, cool. Well, hey, we're talking about the retreat that we were a part of
Mm-hmm.
not too long ago. I was really excited by a lot of the things we shared over that day, and realized we need to really get this on the Well Dwellers
Mm-hmm.
podcast and digest some of it, maybe talk a little more about it. But I also realized it was a ton of stuff we covered.
Yeah.
And I didn't really know. I was thinking, how am I going to fit this into a single episode, an hour and a bit?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, that will keep our listeners engaged. So, I think we should just dive in, but hopefully we don't, we can fit it all in here. Okay. So we kind of started the morning off
Mm-hmm.
talking about the woman at the well.
Yes.
And we reflected in the First Nations translation of the story, but in keeping the story in kind of a synopsis, it's about Jesus and his followers who travel through the land of Samaria, and they stop at a well that's not too far
Mm-hmm.
from a living community. And Jesus sends his followers off to find some supplies and
Mm-hmm.
such. And he's sitting there resting, dry,
Mm-hmm.
and desiring thirst, and along comes this woman from the living community, alone, at the heat of the day, at a very uncommon time to draw water
Mm-hmm.
from this well. And they strike up this conversation as he asks her to draw water for him to drink, and her surprise. And of course there was this dialogue between the two of them as he reveals to her her own story
Mm-hmm.
in a prophetic vision that she questions of, how would you know this about me?
Mm-hmm.
and then he presents her with a new vision of you offer me water, and I am offering you living water. There's a lot of things that we could pull out of this story, and we talked a bit about some of them. You kind of focused on about 4 or 5 different particular themes within the story. The theme of acknowledgement, safety, trust, choice and control, and the element of collaboration. I wondered if you wanted to maybe talk a little bit about that, and maybe we can talk more about some of our other reflections from that day.
Sure. So in The Woman at the Well, those themes he talked about are shaped in what we understand as a trauma-informed community or trauma-informed care approach to engagement with others. And so those reflections really were grown out of a few years ago. I'd given a sermon at the church now closed, unfortunately, but Marta Loop Church, to kind of give this kind of understanding of what is mental illness, mental health, but how do we support, how do we create this, some call it, a safe space, but I always like the idea of a courageous space. This woman wasn't safe. She was avoiding gossipers from her community and what other things would be laid upon her. That's why she was there at the heat of the day doing the hardest work of the day, moving water. I do love when I engage and read this story. I do even see her sassy spirit when she basically, everyone reads this as a very pedantic question. Well, where's your bucket? But I could see her being, pushing back at this other person out here hanging out, and in such a way, not only looking like avoiding this unsafe community, but then the astoundingness of, so you show up to do this work at the heat of the day and you're too stupid to even bring a bucket with you. But there's that. And why do I say courageous? Well, a courageous space speaks to being able to be curious about yourself, being able to be curious about other people, being able to ask questions, and being able to query ideas or experiences without laying a judgment on the person. And that's where Jesus engages with this. I know we're in this era, unfortunately, in our church, a church as a term as a whole, and sadly, because in North America, it really is the American church that drives that narrative of empathy being queried as a sin, where that is the bedrock of what you see in the Gospels with Jesus. He was able to enter that space. He didn't have pity. He didn't have sympathy. He wasn't trying to silver line things for this woman, as Brene Brown would talk about it. He literally just existed with her in space, held her space, and shared what he saw, who she was. And some would say, well, yeah, but he called her out for, shacking up with some dude. No, he didn't. He acknowledged what she needed to do to survive. You have gone through 5 marriages. He already, in those words, the religious world already had labeled her. He wasn't going to knock her and push her and knock her and spit on her while she was down. And he says, but look, even through this journey, you are still here finding ways to engage, finding ways to live. But what happens if we change it from survival? What happens? And these are the courageous, powerful questions that we learn when we get trained as life coaches. This was her powerful question. What happens if you no longer have to come in the heat of the day to get water, but you're able to be in community as the person you are? And as we go through the story, what happened? She was able to see that person that Jesus saw before him at the well. And she went back to her community in this assertive way. And those who would mock her, giggle about her, gossip about her, listened to her because she stood firm. And I'm sure there were some mental health issues with that story that Jesus gave us glimmers of. There's some trauma, there's some depression, there's some abuse recovery work going on there. And here she was. And think of all those different ties that happen in church where you try to, there's that idea that we don't want to affirm mental illness. We don't want to affirm psychology. I've been told that a couple different times from different evangelical traditions. You don't talk about mental illness. You don't talk about therapy. No, those are the gifts of God that help us be healthy. That helps us with an invisible disability. And if we can't help and affirm what helps with invisible disabilities, how can we ever deal with the cure theology for physical disabilities?
Well, I think you can see that too in the story, how not only does he help her, but she takes that storyline and she
Yes.
opens it to the community, right? And she
Yes.
invites them to be part of that story too,
Mhm.
telling them, come back to the well with me.
Yeah. And that intrinsic assertive voice, if that wasn't there, her community would just think of her as they've always thought of her. But something had changed within her by having someone else see her as a person.
Hmm. So, I mean, you kind of talked a bit about safety in that environment.
Mhm.
I think if we look at that story on a deep level, there's risk
Oh,
involved.
yes. And that's that courageous space, right? That you have the safety to risk.
Hmm. Yeah, risk. What happens when, I think in any relationship, it's important to have boundaries as well because
Mhm.
there is that risk. How do we discern and know, and what can we learn from the woman at the well that can teach us about when it is important to be courageous, but also uh, make those courageous moves in healthy forms and not
Mm.
unhealthy?
Well, I think part of it was she had found people that healthily saw her as her, that were willing to understand her journey and pull out the strengths behind it. They were no longer pushing her down, no longer saying, well, this is wrong, this is wrong. Like, you're on this journey, you're going through all these decisions. You're making the best decisions you can in the moment in time you can, depending on what you know in that moment. All she had ever known was the community she was a part of, that I'm sure after the first marriage broke down, she already knew what her station was. And that was
Hmm.
probably reinforced. So that wasn't a safe community for risk. That was a community that was safe to jump through the hoops and stay under people's radar.
Hmm.
And how many times, though, when we think about disabilities in the church, is that the story that church families get or individuals get? Well,
Yeah.
your child's stimming, get them to stop that because it's distracting to the other people in the pew. I'm sorry. Jack down there has been in church for 40 years and is supposed to be praying. How is my child stimming and their connection to the Holy through that stimming, as Father Matthew would say in the God Loves the Autistic Mind, be a distraction if you're supposed to be doing your thing?
Hmm.
How is a joyful noise out of any child, any adult, wrong in church settings, and why should it be shushed? If we're shushing it, there will come a time when we will never have to shush it again because they will not be there and our church will be getting unconsecrated and closed. And I think that's some of the challenge here where she saw a glimmer of that health because Jesus affirmed who she was, affirmed her journey, affirmed what she was able to make in decisions, and then affirmed her to be there in community.
Hmm.
And that is a whole other different level of affirmations from a safe to a courageous space to make that risk. And those are the things one can look for to see if this is the space to make that risk or if this is the space to be in while we explore other spaces that will allow us to be who we're meant to be.
Hmm. Yeah, I remember us talking a bit about the idea of bonded sets and centered sets
Mm-hmm.
as well. And I'm just sort of picturing that in my mind as you're sharing this, that perhaps sometimes in the church, we can sometimes still unknowingly or subconsciously be creating these bonded sets and keeping them separated from other bonded sets, such as
Mm-hmm.
this is your disability ministry, this
Yes.
is your men's ministry,
Mm-hmm.
this is your women's ministry,
Mm-hmm.
so on. And you subconsciously create this solid barrier between them and not allow for an inclusive, intertwining, relational, healthy environment for people to grow with one another, find that acknowledgement, that presence and proximity
Mm-hmm.
to the story, the greater story that they're all a part of in that community, which you can get from a centered set. There is a centered connection that draws you all together to the same well, but we don't need to create these bonded, unhealthy environments that, although we think it creates a safety
Mm-hmm.
shield, it is actually creating an unsafe environment for people to find healing, to find growth
Mm-hmm.
and discipleship and relationship to Jesus. That's what we see with the woman at the well. But if Jesus had remained within those bonded realities of men do not talk to women,
Mm-hmm.
men do not hang out at the well waiting for strange women to come by, nor engage with them,
Mm-hmm.
then that safety of being able to share and grow and heal would have never happened. So I think that, yeah, that's something we can learn from this as well. He created that centered set
Mm-hmm.
to the well, as opposed to a bonded institutional um, blockade
Mm-hmm.
from that relational connections. We could probably hang out more here, but I know we should keep going. So you then started talking about the belonging pyramid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the way we see church within that kind of image. Do you want to kind of unpack that a bit?
Yeah. So if we take a pyramid and invert it, the biggest base is at the top now, and that's accessibility. Most churches will default to this idea of building codes, which, as we know in Alberta, constantly get grandfathered. So you never actually see a building the size of a church ever be up to code unless they undertake a major renovation that changes the vital structures. But there's also pieces of online. We have online standards for web accessibility that many folks don't even think about. So that's like captioning, etc. We can use ASL interpreters during services it's not just if there's a need, but also captioning on our slides during service, on our live streams, alternative texts on our posts in social media. So screen readers can explain what the image is to those with visual impairments. But it's also understanding in this process that when we come to accessibility, sometimes you always have to our buildings are reactive. Well, now we have somebody who needs this. So we should figure out maybe if we can accomplish this, or maybe we should direct them to another church that we know is accessible. Or in our context here in Calgary, we have a mega church that has a disabilities ministry, or as they call special needs ministry. So if you show up, regardless of what your faith affiliation is, or denominational, I should say, affiliation is, or where you want to exist in smaller or medium-sized churches, if it's looking like your child or yourself are going to have some barriers, that's usually the first conversation the board members or minister will have with you, or pastor will have with you, is why don't you attend here? And so those kinds of things to avoid those big conversations. And this was about 12 years ago. The United Church had a person run to be moderator. He used a wheelchair. I sadly can't remember his name, but I remember one quote when the votes were tallied and he didn't win. He said, "This wasn't about me. This was about us not wanting to talk about our buildings as church."
Huh.
And I remember one of the questions that came out of our weekend, one of the challenges was we sometimes even default to, well, historic buildings are more challenging, but should that be our question? Or should it come down to that great question that came out was not can we or can't we, but how do we? How do we grow this accessibility? I mean, you've heard those old stories I've shared from when I was involved in the Catholic Church and that one Basilian priest who just kind of would push ahead and then try to get it paid for after the fact, or there was a lift or showers, right? So if we take that mindset, and I mean, the Basilians come from the tradition of Saint Basil the Great. If you want to read Bronwyn McShay, she has a great story, a great short biography in her book about women in the church, about Basil's sister, how she helped form them. And this was the gent that created the Beth Helibad, where wealthy people could give their money to help care medically for those in need. Those kinds of ideas and shifting. And how do we shift our context? How do we shift our focus in accessibility? And then we come into it. A practical theologian, John Swinton, talks about the politics of inclusion. This is our comfort zone. Folks are comfortable here because as long as we can get you into the building or refer you to a church that you can get into, we feel like we've done our job. Now that you're in it, well, we have a space for you. You may not have choice in the space, but we have a space for you or you and your assist device. So That's inclusion. And this is comfortable because we don't have to deal with any of the icky stuff that comes with being beyond just you existing in the space. Because just existing doesn't mean anyone's actually ever talked to you beyond the general greeting of hi, or maybe even the passing of peace, depending on your tradition. The narrow bottom is the hard part. And that's where Swinton talks about the greatest risk happening. That's belonging. And that means that you have connections with folks in that community. It's not just connections where you do the small idle chit chat on a Sunday morning. These are authentic connections where if you're not there or you miss an event that's happened, folks reach out to you. You're missed, you're known. Not only that, but like how Amos Young talks about us all having a vocational calling. A sermon I did on the 5Q and the disabled God, the Vapus there. Everybody has these gifts, regardless of cognition, abilities, etc. And that's affirmed, and they're finding ways for that to thrive within your community. But why is it a risk? Because that risk comes with the emotions of grieving. That risk comes with the emotions of loss, especially moving to the childhood medically complex community, where that child you're helping thrive may not live to see adolescence, may not live to see adulthood, may flip that script completely on what we assume of the natural ways of a child bearing their parents to now the parents, grandparents, even great-grandparents now with their life expectancies, bearing this child, this grandchild, this great-grandchild, and the community not wanting to take that risk on loss, having to actually challenge their theology around grieving and afterlife because they're comfortable. They like where they exist. That is the risk of belonging. And that's why when I bring that down, it rests in that heart of the great commandment. And I say commandment singular because even though it's three parts, it's one. It's kind of that Trinitarian thing. And this is what brought me back to church as an adult. I don't know, some of your listeners may be old enough to remember in Alberta in grade 5 where you got the Gideon's Red New Testament. Well, I found that as a young adult struggling, it was broken open, and there was the red letters of Jesus in there that brought me back to wanting to explore church again. And it was this great commandment. And part of it was talking about loving the holy mystery, loving God with our everything, in that very Pauline kind of way where he talks about the body. And then coming down to loving our neighbor, which even in some ways we can rationalize. But then that hardest part, like belonging, was loving ourselves. And all three of those parts in sync create this wondrous community. Just like if we can have accessibility beyond building codes into the space that provides choice for inclusion and comfort, which then allows for belonging, creates a whole different community, a community of safety to courage to risk.
Mm-hmm. You had this image up in behind you when you were talking about this at the retreat of a pyramid.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, as you're talking here today and as you were then, I kind of had this kind of two-way image that I was reflecting on that I thought was kind of intriguing. On the one hand, you can see on the surface level, there's a lot of bricks that go together to make this pyramid. If you want to invert it, that's great too. So you invert it, you see the bricks moving in an upwards pattern. If you're building upon this pyramid upside down, you're using more and more bricks to come together to construct it. And I thought this is actually a beautiful way to think of us as we consider building the church in relationships with people and relationships to the dynamics and the complexities of it, that we can't see church being a watering down or a whittling it down into smaller and fewer bricks till you get to the perfected crown. Rather, we're to be building on into the complexities, into the dynamics of what it means to be human and built and made in the image of God. And so that it becomes this amazing construct of what the Holy Spirit and what God has put together, in glorification to Him in His called people in His community. So that's kind of some of the thoughts I had is we shouldn't be limiting our views of what the church can look like or how it constructs, but rather see all those dynamics building into and becoming more and more expressive and multi-layered. Now, on the other hand, you could do it in reverse. If we know Egyptian construct, much like you said, you go into a pyramid, you don't go up, you go down, right?
Yeah.
And as you go down into the pyramid, it becomes and reveals a lot of the things in there. And as you were describing and talking about this idea of going into the bottom of the pyramid, if you will, inverted, that's when it becomes more intimate. You didn't use these words, but the more intimate, the more closer, the more sense of belonging. I just think about that reality that when we build those relationships, we recognize that the complexities and that are building on top, but we are also digging deeper into one another to find new closeness and new ties that bring us together in empathy, compassion, and all the ways that it means to reflect God in those more intimate connections. I don't know if you remember several years ago, there used to be an art piece in Calgary. I used to love driving by it, and I'd stop sometimes and just sit and reflect on it. But it was of this church that was inverted and upside down, stuck in the ground.
Yeah.
And I love that because it would always make me reflect. I used it one time in a presentation and I got a few gasps from the people in the room. But what a beautiful way to reflect and see this is what the church should look like. So it's good. So we moved into stories of before the pew, and we talked a bit about some of the realities here in Alberta, particularly. And I just want to highlight something, a quote from what you had shared that I thought was particularly revealing. How is it possible that in a province where roughly 30% identify with a disability, 1.7 million, if you will, that churches cannot shift out of the cure theology where you are only possible to be fully affirmed as a person if your disability is cured to fit the myth of normalcy? What are you meaning here? Take that further?
Yeah. I like to separate cure and healing a bit. When you read Friar Richard Rohr and others, Dr. Amy Kenny, they cultivate this idea of healing. What is the barrier? Where are the questions we have to ask deeper that is actually causing harm to our neighbor? Rohr used the woman with the perpetual bleeding and going, why did nobody ask? Why did she have to spend all her money and lose everything? So when I think of healing, I think of breaking those systems that do not serve us, but serve profiteering, serve power bases. When I think of cure, it is this idea that there's something intrinsically wrong with us. It comes out of that moralistic lens thinking. This was seen most clearly in sociology through recovery movements, from starting with really alcoholics, opium dens back at the turn of the 20th century, that it was a moral failing or sin, and all they had to do was get strong and they'd be okay. There was nothing else taking into context around what could be happening with the struggle with substances. And that kind of moral thinking is what leads into this cure theology. This idea that, well, if only you were whole as God intended. Think of the story of the man born blind in the Gospel of John. Well, teacher, who sinned in their family? Who sinned in his life? Who did this? Who did that? That ripple effect of that system that keeps impositions. And before the pew, may not be the quote unquote church that's imposing this cure theology, but it's society, it's government, it's structures. As we talked about and shared about being from a child all the way into adulthood, and the different ways you had to prove lack or deficiency to qualify for supports. And then within those supports, how so many of them were um, based on the family putting out the money first and then being remunerated later. So how many more doors were closed as a result of that? And when you talk to a quote unquote typical Albertan, they assume everything is paid for a person with disabilities from childhood to grave. We also shared about, as you retire as a person with a disability, it could be a disability entitlement, it could be employed and disabled, but then your income shrinks. And then whatever your form of health coverage was, if you're on the disability entitlement here in Alberta, you shift from full coverage to now this cost share with Blue Cross insurance. The provincial government keeps growing the share portion on the senior. So all those different things wrestling around, all this different constant living in, well, you're not reaching this benchmark. And that, when we talk about the myth of normalcy out here theology, that is the key. What's the supposed typical, if we want to use that ableist language, child, adult supposed to be doing? And then you shift sadly out of the cherubic childhood, K through, birth through age 11 phase, and they're entering puberty, and everyone knows that awkward junior high phase before you start to emerge looking more like an adult. And it's not so cute anymore in the church pew. And all these things wrestle together. So there is no cure because there's no deficiency. This is part of the mosaic of the Imago Dei. There is no normalcy because life is life. Our question should be, how do we make this person fit into this homogeneous, straight, white culture of full-bodiedness? But how, as we've seen throughout the Gospels, do we make the community grow around to affirm for thriving? And that's where you have 2 times more likely folks with disabilities or families not to bother wanting to be in the pew or the chair on a Sunday morning because of the cure theology, and the myth of normalcy has become not a place of affirmation and thriving, but one more place where you have to fight the battle of personhood for your individual, your child, your loved one, yourself.
I also think, in my own perspective, when often disabled people are coming into the church, there is an automatic assumption, subconsciously or even consciously, that there is excitement around this person coming to Christ, but at the same time, it is viewed as so that they will be cured in a ideological perspective, this life or the next, to fit the parameters as you described. I often get asked or even spoken to in the sense of, won't it be so great when you get to heaven and you can run the fields and walk normally? And I often, part of me is a little bit put off by the statement, but on the other hand, I take excitement in saying, no, actually, I have no idea what I will look like in resurrected form, and I look forward to celebrating and rejoicing in whatever way I do come in the eternal perspective, because I leave that mystery, that mysticism to my Creator's hands, to God's hands. I don't need to stress and worry about what's going to be cured this life or the next. Our desire to be in relationship with God and in church community is to be in a submission to that mystery, not to my own expectations. And I think that, I don't know, maybe disabled people might get that more than the normal people who would enter the church space.
Well, I think that was one of wonderful conversations that came out when we talked about communion or potlucks and the different ways people nourish themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And we brought up the idea of feeding tubes. And I get the apprehensiveness because if we are to look at quote unquote normalcy, I don't know what you were talking about. So it's rude to eat in front of people when they're not eating or can't eat.
Mm-hmm.
Yet then we have medically complex communities where there's the by mouth to feeding tube and they'll eat together because it's about being together. How we nourish isn't the relevant piece. But again, to get into that comfort space, it disrupts what we know. But then, as you had asked that, brought up in that retreat, it also then disrupts sacramental life. Because then what is the purpose of communion?
Mm-hmm.
There's always that argument between just elements to transubstantiation, which we could not waste time, but we can go down that rabbit hole. But what happens if you can't take the elements regardless of what your theological belief is around them?
Mm-hmm.
Does the mystical moment of communion in community with the body on earth and in heaven vanish because of that? Or is it up to us to realize the person with disabilities doesn't exist in our community as we're normally taught theologically to affirm our gifts, but they exist as a fully functional part of the body to affirm their gifts in community? And what happens when we diverge from our simplistic textbook answers of recitation we learn in confirmation,
Mm-hmm.
and we actually have to live in that messiness of the body? Like, you just think about that metaphor of body. Bodies are messy, man.
Hmm.
Doesn't matter what form they take. And that's what we're given for church. And then we're trying to put parameters on what part of the body can exist or how they're to exist. Disabilities is the only community one can join without choice for a short term or a long term.
Mm-hmm. And I think uh, the disabled life, the disabled body can be very messy too.
Mm-hmm.
But I think of the words of Jesus in that experience of the sacrament though, and how important it is for us to acknowledge. It's not just this is my body. This is my body broken
Mm-hmm.
for you. He doesn't present it whole, which is what we hear in
Mm-hmm.
churches of we're presenting a whole body for you to be a part of. No, we present a broken body for
Mm-hmm.
you to take, eat, and be a part of. This is my blood poured out for you and for many. It's the communal commissioning expression of we all come together, broken bodies, messy,
Mm-hmm.
and with our own
Mm-hmm.
different understandings, and we pour them out for many
Yeah.
to find that soteriology, that salvation, that freeing, healing, coming together to find a renewed understanding of
Mm-hmm.
wholeness. This is really we are really going deep here today, Ty.
Well, I think that touches on, and that touches the other thing about the retreat that we talked about and dissected is the spectrum of disabilities. We have Nowen, who writes about his companion Adam, who had an intellectual disability, and said his sermons, his presentations weren't complete if Adam wasn't with them. And I think it was you that touched upon this, wanting the deeper theological conversations and this idea of that intergenerational, that interdemographic mix, if you will. Why do we separate so much when these can exist all together? And we can have that messiness of that community time together, flowing, learning. And somebody may share, like when I used to run a house church, the children may pop in from their place time and share a thought on something they heard from the story and pop out and go back to where they are engaged in community, and our depth of conversation keeps going. but we're seeing that growth. We're seeing that relational connection that's happening in that spiritual formation process, because it's a spectrum. It's not just about getting into the altar for a sinner's prayer. It's not just about dunking or sprinkling them. Or what if you can't dunk or sprinkle because of the disability, because of the trauma, maybe? Then how do you affirm baptism? That's an old street
Mhm.
pastor question.
Yeah.
Again, challenging the sacramental life. Then to even confirmation, which is supposed to be a beginning point of understanding these questions. But then we kind of stall out on the milk or pablum, as Paul wrote. And we don't want to go deeper, because if we go deeper, then us who are in the pulpit, or us who are the writers, or the thinkers, or the teachers, or the prophets, or the apostles, may have to acknowledge we don't have all the answers, or that we're unable to communicate all the answers because the person who has an answer they're communicating is maybe using a pod book or Pix or some other communication assist device that may not give the full thought, but that simple answer that comes through may actually be the one we need. And that
Mhm.
raises the question I brought out in the 5Q and Disabled God sermon is the masters, the seminary, the only way one could be affirmed as a teacher or a shepherd.
Mhm.
But at the same time,
Yeah.
we need those equipped and trained at that deeper level as well. And that's the messiness of the body, because it doesn't give a one way, one pathway answer to quote unquote colored ministry. And this is probably why I get in a
Yeah.
lot of trouble in churches. Because regardless of where I exist, I have issues.
Yeah, well, me too. So, and we talked a bit about missional backgrounds and stuff
Mm-hmm.
too. But I remember years ago seeing this great documentary, and I wish I could remember what it was called. But it talked about bringing back the idea of parish relationships.
Mm-hmm.
That when we see community and the call of God's people, it's not to the church.
Mm-hmm.
It's a intertwining relationship between church, parish, and community, right? So that you move outwards. In the older times, the church priest would go out into the parish and interact and build relationships, have a pint at the local pub, go to the farmer's fields and work the field with him while he's doing his daily chores, be there at the local shops and restaurants and stuff. I'm a house church guy. This is what I
Mm-hmm.
love. This is what I see when people ask me, where is your church? Is it in your house? I say, no. A house church is not a house church because it's in a house. A house church is because it's a group of community people coming together that do church everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And and so we share that, and then we go into the community so that I see my church and my parish through relational ties and ligaments throughout my entire daily
Mm-hmm.
activities and life.
Mm-hmm.
And Nowen proves this with Adam, right?
Mm-hmm.
He leaves the institution to go into the living environment of this cognitively disabled young man, Adam,
Mm-hmm.
and rediscovers the church.
Yeah.
So the pews, if we want to say that, are on wheels.
And they need to be. And that's the beauty of the parish model, because you are ingrained in your community. And except now we're in a transit model. So how do we
Yeah.
change the parish into transits? That
Yeah.
speaks, I think, to hospitality, especially with the ableist myth of normalcy that those who stream online are lazy. And
Yeah.
it's like, no, there's multitude of reasons. My question is, why haven't you figured out hospitality online to create community there
Mm.
so that they are part of and interwoven into that congregational life? I
Hmm.
shared a little bit of that story of the chaos that happened coming out of COVID at one church I was with. We used to have the streaming online, then one or two people would go and connect with the people on Zoom for coffee, and we'd have our own coffee. And then that day that we decided to roll the TV out, and yeah, it created some chaos, but it also created some awe moments as folks started to see those they hadn't seen for so long. and realizing who was missing and why, and then creating those conversations and renewing those connections. And so it does raise the question, how do we make it sometimes less professional, but more authentic? And we can't hide behind technology is causing this. Just like churches can't hide behind, well, it's tough. Since COVID, we have to pay to keep the lights on, so we can't look at this or that for accessibility. And I've been in churches in leadership for a long time. We had all those excuses before COVID. COVID didn't change anything. It maybe just accelerated some things as some of those that were just there out of habit fell away and maybe accelerated a bit instead of 20 years to get where we were going to reimagine church life as the soul of the community in Canada as opposed to a power structure. Maybe now it's 5 or 10.
So that is a great way to move into too as we continue this journey from the retreat. How do we make things accessible? What is accessibility? What do we mean by accessibility?
I think I was being a bit cheeky that more too, because I talked about accessibility of spiritual formation. So one of the things that happens when you learn universal design for learning, they point to universal design in our communities, which, as both of us as Calgarians know, the city doesn't always follow through well on. Universal design is like a cutout on a sidewalk. The McDonald's up the road from me, I can't take my kid to anymore because the new boulevards got put in and the private company didn't put the cutouts in. But that kind of metaphor of, if you make it the change for one group, for the persons with disabilities need mobility aids, it helps everybody, because who, as a cyclist, as a walker, how does a cutout not aid you in making your way across the road? The idea of the ramp into a building, if it's actually in a healthy spot and designed around the actual entrance, everyone can use the ramp to enter. It doesn't have to, stairs become redundant. The idea of a lift. The lift not only helps get those with mobility devices through the building, but it also helps you be able to host things in different parts of the building you may not be able to, because now you can move food, you can move furniture, you can move multiple things, the ease of life. And the mobility device someone's using may not be a walker or a wheelchair. It could be a stroller, a baby carriage. It could be those simple things as well that we think about, that generational piece. So that idea of universal design then applied to learning in an educational context is, what do we know are the most requested accommodations for students? And then you make that just your standard starting point. So then the accommodation process gets way more specialized into the individual realm. But if we go make this accommodation that we know usually has to happen, we just apply it across the board, it benefits everybody. And we don't have to add that stigma layer. And so these are things taking into account with our buildings, with our online presence, as you said, making church everywhere. Do all the programs have to happen in somebody's home or the church building? I shared the example, ran a youth ministry in a church that didn't have a building. So people's homes became our youth group hangout places and community spaces. We would play Bible trivia games at the Tim Hortons, where people in the Tim Hortons would actually try and help the youth, those kinds of things. So you actually create this weird community space. And weird being that the folks you wouldn't expect to connect would connect. So those kinds of ideas for accessibility. Accessibility at its core is opening up the space so everyone in your community can actually get into it. Online, physical. And when I think of universal design for learning, I always have to ask the question, as a former children's, youth, and young adults pastor and associate pastor, how does this apply to spiritual formation? How do we make that the most accessible? And that's not by stripping it all down to a few simple words, but literally, how do we help people grow with who they are in God? That discipling phase.
Yeah. You had an image during this part of our talk of an accessible parking stall up on your PowerPoints. And I remember talking a bit about how we like to stick to the lines, right?
Yeah.
If you park outside of those lines or cross over those lines, you have somehow betrayed the laws of accessibility.
Yeah.
And I've had personal experience with this in the literal form as I shared that weekend. But I think one of the things I wanted to highlight and make important is when we think of accessibility, it's not about asking the government or any other institution for the policy handbook of what's accessible and what's not. It's being willing to have an imagination that takes you beyond the boundaries of regulation and policy. It's about being willing to engage the people that are a part of your community who have such needs and learning to do it even beyond their expectation. When you were just talking a few minutes ago, I thought of the story of Jesus telling his disciples, "You will do the things I have done, but not just the things I have done, but even greater things." So when we think about making the church accessible, why don't we not just ask, what can we do to make our building great or our community even great? But how can we make it beyond the expectations of any other in a universal pattern of embodying and exemplifying inclusion and openness and an environment for growth and experiencing the presence of God for all? Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I really reflect on when I think about that. The friends that carried the paralytic to the house, whatever possessed them to think, well, let's just rip the roof off this house. That's an easy way to fix this.
Yeah.
It's not just about the construct, not just about the physicality, but the mental awareness and mindset to have the imagination of not why can't we do this, but how can we do this?
Yeah. How do we pull this off? How do we do this?
How do
And
we
I
do
think
this?
that's because everyone's been conditioned. Like I said, people in disabilities community conditioned to be fragmented and not speak with a communal voice because my need's bigger than this need. So why should you get this and I can't get this? But even when it comes to building codes, well, if we make you come up just to the codes, which is the bare minimum, let's keep it honest. The building code is the bare minimum so you don't get sued. Your building can open its doors. Why do we allow so much grandfathering of the bare minimum of 50 years ago, which we know doesn't work, is what's acceptable still? And it comes down to part of it is money and part of it is comfort. Because we like to know what we know and we don't like to be uncomfortable by having to step into our own self-created fear of lack and scarcity. Yes, lack and scarcity exists in our lives. I'm not going to say it doesn't, but we tend to rest in there as comfort when it comes to having to disrupt and change things for the better. And part of it is, could you imagine the change that would happen in this world if the couple billion Christians actually pushed global governments to make their countries fully accessible? And just think of what that would look like if we didn't worry about historic designation, but we, instead of complaining that we tear down old buildings, go, what makes it so that everybody can engage with this historic piece of our history? And how do we do that? What needs to happen and make it happen? And yeah, that may mean they get lifts. Well, that's not historically accurate. So what? Now that person can be in the choir loft. Now that person can choose to sit in the balcony if they want to. They don't have to be in the one designated or two designated areas.
Yeah. I think even from a leadership standpoint and perspective, church leadership and the board members and such need to be, I mean, back to the APES model, right? We can't just leave the leadership imagination strictly to the shepherds and teachers to uphold the imagination. If we want to have an imaginative, accessible community, then we need to be willing to have apostolic and prophetic and evangelistic, but okay, I'm being biased, but particularly prophetic and apostolic visionaries who are going to say, no, we don't need to be restricted by the boundaries. We want to take us beyond what is expected. and be able to find new expressive ways of what church looks like for our disabled neighbors and marginalized who are a part of our greater community. So let's do this differently. Leadership needs to take that in.
And imagine if those same voices then pushed the church into affirming more education by going, who are our artists? Who are our architects? Who are engineers? We want to gather you together, throw out the building code. What makes this an accessible space? Who are our educators? Who are our writers? Who are our thinkers? This is kind of where we're at. The store-bought curriculums don't work. How do we create an accessible spiritual formation from cradle to grave?
Yeah. And, taking a little bit too, and I know I threw you the question, why does accessibility matter spiritually? Leaders can ask the question of how can we take the gospel message and present it in new imaginative ways, particularly how can I learn from those marginalized communities of what accessible spirituality looks like. It's not about, oh, I don't have a disability ministry, so disabled conferences and disabled theology don't matter to me. It's rather I need to hear and learn from these communities so that I can present the gospel in new imaginative ways to my whole neighborhood, my whole people that are a part of my center well.
And I would even challenge the way we talk about theology. And I've been guilty of this too, because I took, the seminary class, the theology of the marginalized. And let's flip it, because in the diaconia, we're talking about the invisible majority of our world. We're talking about BIPOC, we're talking about queer, we're talking about two-spirited, LGBTQI, we're talking about women and feminist, we're talking about disabled, and all the ones I can't think of right now that I apologize with my addled brain and neurology myself. So please leave in the comments the ones we forgot so I can learn. That's the majority. And we're called to enmesh in the world and be in community and take that safety to courage to risk. We saw at the well, rip off the roof, which I always chuckle at sometimes because like I said, it was one of my favorite stories teaching VBS and children's ministries. And then one of my church roofs fell in, and I did kind of laugh and chuckle at the irony of that. But it did. It pushed that church into the community and doing things differently. What does this look like? How do we rethink this? When you don't have the building, it's different. And whether or not we want to admit it, sometimes the building is the albatross we have to look at and ask ourselves, if we didn't have to ask ourselves that powerful question, who are we without the building? How do we gather? And that's where you can get to. I was finished a book from the president of the Lutheran Seminary at the Saskatoon Theological Union, Harrison, on leadership for shrinking churches. And he tied in that idea of what's the gospel vision for your community as things change, because that gives you your core values. So if we remove the building, I don't care if we're talking about a community of 15 believers or 4,500 that can run the full-on funded disability ministry. If we don't have the building, who are we? What are we meant to be in community? And how do we do that? And then guess what? If you have a building, that's a blessing piece of Community Hub you can leverage and play with. And if you don't, you've now got these wonderful answers on how to be in the communities your members exist in. As well as if you have a building. I don't want to narrow that either. Just because you have a building, you don't have to be enmeshed in communities.
Oh, and I'm going to add too, if you are blessed to have a building, how might you leverage your building space to not enforce red tape and political policy of exclusion, but rather use it to leverage the breakdown of red tape and policy exclusion?
What shifts if you say our building is the communities? So if a person from the community comes in and it's not for spewing hate and says, hey, do you have space for? And the answer, instead of being, well, it's $4.50 an hour, going, yes, here you go.
So we have we want to talk a bit about inclusion and then we'll talk in closing about belonging. But I know this particular passage is particularly meaningful to you.
Mm-hmm.
But in talking about inclusion, you took out the First Nations story of the little children and the good road. So I want to share it with our listeners first before we talk, and then we'll explore it a bit. So it begins. The people were bringing their little children to Creator Sets Free, Jesus, so he would lay his hands on them and bless them. But his followers spoke harsh words to the ones bringing them. When Creator Sets Free, Jesus, saw what his followers were doing, it made him angry. So he said to them, "Let the little children come to me. Do not turn them away. Creator's good road belongs to the ones who are like these children. I speak from my heart. The only way onto Creator's good road is to become as trusting as a little child." He then took the children into his arms, laid his hands on them, and blessed them.
Mm.
Why is this story so meaningful and important to you, Ty?
I come from, in the church side, my mom's side, a history of Sunday school teachers. So this was my mom's favorite story of Jesus being with the children
Mm,
and affirming them. My son inherited her picture we had gotten her of Jesus with the little children when she passed. When I came back to church, my second week in church, I became a Sunday school teacher. I was the young person. I think I dropped the average age of the church by 20 years. So it's most of their grandkids, some of them were kids. And this is what really showed me some of the things we create that are inaccessible. I'm not saying church block curriculums aren't wonderful, beautiful resources, but my nan was excited that I was a Sunday school teacher. She gifted me one of her Bibles she got when she left England as a war bride. So I had a King James Bible. And the next, just an hour or 2 hour before church, I got there and I was handed a 4-inch curriculum binder. So I opened up to the week we're on that they told me to go to. I have a King James Bible. I was a VBS kid, a Vacation Bible School kid, an ecumenical one. So Presbyterian, Lutherans, assorted other types. I had gone to the Alliance preschool in my area, not necessarily because my parents were Alliance people, but because the community one was under investigation. So everyone went to the Alliance preschool. So we sang Jesus Loves Me with a nice mosaic of Sikh and other religious affiliations as well. And I was baptized Anglican in a Catholic school gymnasium with Presbyterian godparents. I've always had this ecumenical interdenominational vibe. So open this up, but very much Jesus-centered stories, as you can tell. So open up the curriculum. I scanned through and I kind of flipped through my Bible, still a bit confused. My youth gather. I got 2 questions right off the bat from this. Okay, first off, I hold my King James Bible, go, who knows how to use this? And second off, who knows what a Ruth is? Because the story for the day was out of Ruth. Like I said, a wonderful store-bought curriculum costs the church thousands of dollars every year, but was it accessible to the teachers? Was it accessible to the youth? Did it help us connect them to the greater story? And more importantly, being curious enough to investigate their own selves and their own faith. And so I use that to share that this is where accessibility begins with. But also too, with this passage, what I love is there was cultural norms at play, societal norms. And we've all seen those societal norms still ripple into churches. How many of you have been sitting in a church and children are children? And then there is the one that shushes. How many of you may have been in a Christian education committee meeting and the conversation is, well, do we have the kids up in church or do we just send them directly to Sunday school? Do we have a children's time before they go or do we just dismiss them after announcements? More of taking that format like these disciples did. Well, the children are the nuisance. Yes, we want them because we want to keep being around, but not just yet. Let's give them their own little inclusive spot. Here you're supposed to be quiet. We'll bring you out a couple times a year. We'll bring you out for the Christmas pageant. Maybe we'll throw you a bone with intergenerational service where we'll smile cutely as you stumble around. And we'll let one of the youth give a pre-approved message. But don't rock the boat. Don't disrupt things. Don't be noisy. Don't go digging around the church basements, right? And I'm going, and you have this beautiful passage where Jesus looks at his followers. I can almost see him do the face palm. Like, seriously. Or the Picard meme where he's kind of like this, like, have you not been paying attention?
Yeah.
And this isn't in the paternalistic sense towards persons with disabilities, because that's garbage as well. This is a disenfranchised, really ultra marginalized group within gatherings at that point in time in history. And what does Jesus say? Get them over here. I would have loved, this is where I talk about the Ignatian imagination and contemplation. What happens if you enter the story as one of those kids? And now all of a sudden, you're the one on Jesus' lap. A moment in time that not only disrupts gender norms, where moments like that for the children were taught by the women. Jesus is with them as the man. A gender norm disruption. But also a societal norm disruption of seeing the child not as we would in capitalistic parasitic constructs of an expense or something we should tolerate, but as a full member, a full person of community that we're here to help embrace and allow them to grow and thrive into how God made them to be and who God made them to be.
Huh.
And what changes with this story, if that's the viewpoint we take, and we don't take the tweet version that I learned in evangelical circles of, well, it means to be kind of childlike. It means that we don't have to be so serious. It means we don't have to go deep. It means we can stay at the pablum level. No. It means for Jesus, you have created barriers in your own system to keep out folks who so desperately want connection.
Mm.
And I'm showing you those barriers need to be broken. We need a healing where it's not only generations existing together, but all the different members of the body of Christ together.
I'm curious if they need to be broken or just respected and held together in community. And I say that because I'm just sort of imagining the way I often describe the need for cocoons in community. I've been asked, why do we need a disability ministry within a church community? And in a similar fashion, I say, well, because we need that cocoon space to which a community of disabled people can come together, find an affirmation, a safe environment in which to develop, grow, mature in their understanding of disability and dignity, understand their spirituality from a disabled theological perspective in a healthy form and from good nourishment and teaching. So it has that kind of boundary space. But this is the thing about cocoons. It's not meant to keep people out. It's not meant to keep elements out from entering that space either. It's a permeable barrier which others can come in and bring nutrients and participate and help develop those within that cocoon space until they flourish, until they butterfly out and are able to take part in the greater life of the tree, if you will, of that space. So as Jesus calls these children together and he begins speaking to these children, I picture it as being an environment in space where he is engaging and discipling these young youth. In a bigger perspective and picture, he's also speaking and discipling and teaching those around him, the other adults, the other men and women, the Pharisees, the Sumerian people, if they're there, whoever might be there. And it becomes that space. So why have disability ministry? Because it creates a cocoon environment for growth, but it also enriches the life of the greater community as they take part in that nourishment, as they take part in that story of what it means to grow with diversity in your inclusive journey. You know, as we've been talking now for almost an hour and a half. Yeah, I knew it was going to be a lot. I want to touch on belonging before we close off, because we really finished around belonging, and you also finished around sharing the passage from the greatest of instruction. Again, reading from First Nations translation. When the separated ones, the Pharisees, heard how he silenced the upright ones, the Sadducees, they put their heads together and came up with a plan. One of them, who was an expert in tribal law, would put him to the test. The expert came to him. "Wisdom keeper," he asked, "which instruction in our tribal law stands first?" "Creator sets free," Jesus answered him. "You must love the Great Spirit from deep within, with the strength of your arms and thoughts of your mind and the courage of your heart. This is the first and greatest instruction. The second is like the first," he added. "You must love your fellow human beings in the same way you love yourselves. The law of the words of the prophets all find their full meaning in these two instructions." So, you know, as I was reading through that, I just came back to that word you shared earlier about loving yourselves and how important it is for disabled people to love themselves, to not necessarily be impacted by some of the biased ableism that is around them today, that is telling them that they are lacking, that they are not quite whole, that they are not accepted, and that they are not loved. We need to be able to love ourselves, I think, to really begin to seek a lot of the greater story that God wants for us. So I'm just going to start there, see what your thoughts are.
No, it's true. And I think that's where the permeable, the malleable, that idea that we can flow in and out of a cocoon becomes a bit of a danger zone in churches, though, too. Because how often do we, to speak from my background with youth and children's ministries, and how often we set caveats. Well, once you hit 23, you can't be a youth pastor anymore because it gets creepy. Our youth will teach our Sunday school. You know, that's a big thing. And so you lose this discipleship model of lived wisdom. And we have a children's ministry. We have a place for your kids. We have a place for your babies. We have a place for your youth. We have a place for seniors. We have a place for this. Does it just become another checklist to show inclusion because it's where we're comfortable? But yeah, as you point out, when though does it actually become actualized? I know many people freak out the word representation. I'm a Trekkie. We've been big on representation for almost 60. Martin Luther King
Yes, we
Jr.
have.
even spoke to representation when the actress wanted to leave her, Nichelle Nichols, right?
Kapla.
Yes. And you look at disabilities in Trek, it's not about curing. Illnesses, yes. But disabilities, it's what is necessary for them to achieve what they're meant to be. And that means that if we're truly this community, then when we're on our live stream, or if you're just attending and they don't stream, you're going to see representations from the demographics that make up that body of Christ. And if you're not seeing that representation week to week, then it's just lip service and segregation. And that may sound a bit harsh, but that means you've stalled out an inclusion. And the inclusion politics Swinton talks about, that comfort zone of, hey, there's a space. we're okay. Jesus calls us out of that. I love it because when you read Swinton's background is dementia and mental illness chaplaincy.
Hmm.
So it's a whole different idea of discipleship. And then you have that spectrum of conversations and spiritual formation, discipleship that needs to happen because age isn't as relevant.
Mhm.
And then what happens? And then what happens when they're not there? This is where you find out if y'all really do belong. There's in many spaces I've existed in, I've ministered in, and when I wasn't there, or my family wasn't there, or somebody we knew in need wasn't there, nobody reached out to them. Nobody reached out to us. Unless there was a need that needed to be filled, and all of a sudden, well, you're the only one that can do this. No, I'm tired. The
Mhm.
body needs to learn. And just because we have the lived experience doesn't mean we're the one that needs to fill that need. Just like with the work of reconciliation with Indigenous folks on Turtle Island, they don't always have to be the ones doing the heavy lifting. It's up to us to learn and grow from there. Just the same as the folks that may not be currently disabled. And if we change our communities to have accessibility and inclusion across the lifespan, all of a sudden our conversations shift and it becomes very uncomfortable. But in that discomfort, with that authentic safety in that discomfort, we can get some courage, we can get some risk, and we can truly start to understand what it means to grieve, what it means to lose, and what it means to love our neighbors and also to love ourselves, because we are those created images that Jesus talked about in that first part of the commandment.
I think those are beautiful words to kind of land on as we come to a conclusion of our talk today, but also a great call for this conversation to
Mhm.
continue, not just with us, but with the greater well community. For my listeners, talk to your neighbors about this.
Mm.
Talk to your church leaders about this. Talk to those that are connected to you and can also build on what it means to be a loving, inclusive, accessible, belonging community. I want to thank you all for listening. Before we go, I want to have a little bit of fun
Mhm.
and just let our listeners know about Ty and I had this amazing, great conversation in past,
Yes.
as you may have picked up on Star Trek and disabilities. So I will leave a link in the show notes for you to have another listen
Mhm.
to that or listen to it for the first time. It's a great episode. And for the fun part before we go, Ty, what is the greatest Star Trek episode that has ever aired?
Um, I like the humor of the two Tribbles episodes, but really when it comes down to how institutions treat people with disabilities,
Mm.
Deep Space Nine's Take Me Out to the Holosuite, and seeing how Cisco, as the Jesus figure in Bajoran religion and the ethically struggling commander during a war, treats Rom, a Ferengi player who can't comprehend baseball. And then all of a sudden, seeing that shift and what happens in those moments and how the community happens. I think it's those, what we call filler episodes, that really do touch on that.
Yeah, you just made a post about that recently. I remember seeing it. And what a great fitting way to bring us to a conclusion as we think about the World Series starting
Yes.
tonight. And Cisco, take me out to the Hollow Suite.
Yes.
Where all belong and all discover new things. So, Ty Regan, thank you so much for joining me today here at the Well and in the Well Dwellers community. Your wisdom is always loved here. I know you'll be back. We'll be talking more again, but thank you for being with me today and the listeners.
Thank you.